The morning sun was already brutal when Sarah Martinez pulled into the gravel parking lot of Windmark Canyon Range. Her beat-up Honda Civic looked pitiful next to the gleaming F-150s and custom gun cases being unloaded by burly men in tactical gear. She sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, watching competitors swagger toward the registration table like they owned the place. Sarah had driven 6 hours from Phoenix with nothing but a thermos of coffee and a rifle case that had seen better days. The Windmark Open Division was legendary in long-range shooting circles, a competition that separated weekend warriors from true marksmen. She'd registered online 3 months ago, using her savings from her job as a software engineer at a defense contractor. At the registration table, a weathered man with staff emblazoned across his polo shirt barely glanced up when she approached. His nameplate read, "Jim Henley, Range Director." "Sarah Martinez," she said quietly, sliding her confirmation email across the table. Jim's eyes flicked to her gear, then back to his clipboard. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth as he handed her a laminated badge. "Lane 47, bottom seed." He pointed toward the far end of the firing line with obvious dismissal. "Try not to embarrass yourself out there, sweetheart." Heat flushed Sarah's cheeks, but she simply nodded and walked away. Around her, the atmosphere buzzed with testosterone-fueled bravado. Men unpacked equipment that cost more than her car. Custom rifles with carbon fiber barrels, computerized scopes, and range-finding devices that looked like they belonged in NASA. She found her assigned spot at the very end of the line, separated from most competitors by empty lanes. Her neighbors barely acknowledged her presence, too busy comparing their expensive gear and war stories. Sarah unpacked methodically, her grandfather's modified Remington 700, a basic scope, and a worn notebook filled with hand-calculated ballistics data. "Well, well," came a gravelly voice behind her. "Looks like someone took a wrong turn from the indoor range." Sarah turned to see Griffin Hayes, a former Army sniper whose face graced every shooting magazine cover. His reputation preceded him, 3-time Windmark champion, social media influencer, and owner of a successful tactical training company. He stood with his entourage, arms crossed, studying her setup like she was an amusing sideshow. "This is precision shooting, little lady," Griffin continued, loud enough for nearby competitors to hear. "Not a Girl Scout camp." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Sarah felt dozens of eyes on her, cameras already starting to point in her direction. The Windmark Open was live-streamed, and she was apparently about to become viral content. "Know what this is?" Sarah replied evenly, adjusting her rifle's position on the mat. Griffin's smile turned predatory. "Do you now? Because this isn't about participation trophies. We're shooting out to 1,500 meters. Men have been doing this for decades, perfecting the art. You sure you can handle that kind of pressure?" The condescension in his voice was thick, enough to cut. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd heard variations of this speech her entire career, in college engineering classes, at her defense job, anywhere she dared to enter male-dominated spaces. "I guess we'll find out," she said simply. As Griffin walked away, chuckling with his crew, Sarah tried to ignore the whispers that followed. She was used to being underestimated, but something about this felt different. More hostile, more personal. She glanced at her notebook, filled with calculations she'd worked on for months. Her grandfather had taught her to shoot on his ranch in Texas, passing down not just marksmanship, but the mathematical precision behind it. He'd been a Marine in Vietnam, and his lessons went far beyond pulling triggers. The PA system crackled to life. "Shooters, prepare for the 600-meter warm-up round. Ladies and gentlemen, Let's see what you're made of. Sarah settled into position, trying to block out the snickers and camera clicks around her. She had no idea that her real test was just beginning. The mockery begins. The 600-meter target stood like steel sentinels in the distance, heat waves already beginning to shimmer in the morning sun. Sarah positioned herself behind her rifle, feeling the familiar comfort of the worn stock against her cheek. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. Breathe steady, think clear, shoot straight. Her first shot rang out, followed by the distant ping of steel. A hit, but not centered. Murmurs spread through the crowd of observers. Not bad for a beginner, someone called out, the sarcasm unmistakable. Marcus Webb, the event's announcer, and a former local news anchor spoke into his microphone with theatrical flair. Well, folks, our mystery shooter in lane 47 manages to hit the broad side of a barn. Progress! Laughter erupted from the gallery. Sarah's face burned, but she kept her focus downrange. Her second shot landed closer to center, and her third found the inner ring. Respectable shooting by any measure, but the crowd seemed determined to find fault. 3 shots, 3 different spots, observed Brett Kane, a cocky engineer from California who'd been posting range videos on social media for years. He held up his tablet, showing his own tight grouping. That's what happens when you don't have real equipment. Math can't fix fundamental problems. Brett's comment stung because it revealed how little he understood about her approach. While others relied on expensive computerized systems, Sarah used manual calculations based on environmental conditions. Her notebook contained pages of formulas, wind charts, and ballistic coefficients that she'd painstakingly calculated herself. At 800 meters, the difficulty ramped up significantly. Sarah took extra time between shots, consulting her notes and making adjustments. This methodical approach drew more mockery. "Is she doing homework out there?" Griffin called out from his lane. "Maybe she should have brought a calculator too." Dieting's joke hit closer to home than he knew. Sarah had indeed brought a small calculator hidden in her kit alongside the handwritten charts. While other shooters relied on apps and digital systems, she trusted the old-school methods her grandfather had taught her. When she fired her 800-meter group, the results were better, tighter, and more consistent. But instead of acknowledgement, she heard whispers about beginner's luck and random chance. Jim Henley approached her position during the break, ostensibly to check equipment but clearly looking for problems. He examined her rifle with exaggerated scrutiny, measuring this and that with obvious skepticism. "This scope mount looks loose," he announced, loud enough for others to hear. "Safety concern. You'll need to have it checked before the next round." Sarah knew her equipment was solid. She'd verified everything twice before leaving home. But she also knew better than to argue with the range director in front of a crowd. She spent her break time rechecking connections that didn't need checking, feeling like a student being singled out by a hostile teacher. During the 1,000-meter round, the harassment escalated. Someone accidentally bumped her table while she was taking notes, scattering her carefully organized data sheets. When she politely asked for space to collect them, she was met with exaggerated apologies that fooled no one. "Oops, sorry about that," said the offender, a middle-aged man with a beer gut and a Molen Labe t-shirt. "Didn't see you down there." The live-stream chat, visible on monitors around the range, began filling with comments about diversity hires and virtue signaling. Screenshots of her confused expressions were being turned into memes in real time. Marcus Webb seemed to delight in reading the more creative insults on air. "The internet wants to know if lane 47 brought a purse instead of a proper range bag," Marcus announced with theatrical timing. "I have to say, folks, the optics aren't great." The pun on optics referring both to her scope and her appearance, drew huge laughs from the crowd. Sarah felt her cheeks burning with humiliation, but she kept her mouth shut and her eyes downrange. As the day progressed, she noticed a pattern. When male shooters made mistakes, they were met with supportive comments or gentle ribbing. When she made identical errors, they became evidence of her fundamental unsuitability for the sport. Her successes were minimized or explained away, while her failures were magnified and broadcast. But something else was happening too. Her shots were getting more consistent, her calculations were proving accurate, and despite the hostile environment, she was slowly, quietly climbing the rankings. Griffin Hayes noticed too. During the lunch break, he made a point of walking past her table, speaking just loud enough for others to hear. "Must be nice having the whole internet watching," he said with false sympathy. "Hope you're ready for the afternoon rounds. Things get real serious at 1-200 meters and beyond. That's where we separate the sheep from the shepherds." Sarah looked up from her notebook, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. "I'll be ready." Something in her tone made Griffin's smile falter slightly. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. Then he recovered his swagger and walked away, but Sarah had seen it. She was getting to them. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as competitors prepared for the 1-200-meter challenge. Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead, trying to ignore the growing crowd of spectators who seemed more interested in watching her fail than appreciating good marksmanship. The live stream viewer count had tripled, and she'd become the unofficial entertainment of the day. Her shooting had improved steadily through the morning rounds, and she'd quietly moved up to the middle of the pack. This progress hadn't gone unnoticed by Griffin Hayes and his crew, who seemed increasingly irritated by her persistence. "Lucky streaks got to end sometime," Brett Kane muttered as he passed her lane, loud enough for the cameras to pick up. "Physics doesn't lie, and neither do fundamentals." Sarah was adjusting her bipod when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Her ammunition box, the carefully organized container where she kept her hand-loaded rounds, had been moved. The orientation was wrong, and when she opened it, several cartridges were missing from their foam slots. Her stomach dropped. Each round had been precisely measured and loaded for specific distances. Without them, her calculations would be worthless. She quickly counted what remained, enough to finish the competition, but barely. "Excuse me," she said to Jim Henley as he walked past. "Someone's been in my ammunition." Jim barely slowed down. "Equipment is the shooter's responsibility. Maybe keep better track of your gear." The dismissal was so casual, so obviously unfair, that Sarah felt her composure crack. She looked around for support, but found only averted eyes and uncomfortable expressions. The other competitors suddenly seemed very interested in their own equipment. Marcus Webb's voice boomed over the PA system. "Shooters to the line for 1-200 meters. This is where we start separating the wheat from the chaff, folks." Sarah forced herself to focus. She'd come too far to let sabotage stop her now. Using her remaining ammunition, she'd have to make every shot count. No room for mistakes, no mulligans, no second chances. As she settled into position, she noticed Tom Rodriguez, an older Hispanic man shooting 2 lanes over, giving her a subtle nod of encouragement. He was one of the few competitors who hadn't joined in the mockery, and his expression now held something like respect. The 1-200-meter shot was a different beast entirely. The steel target looked impossibly small through her scope, a distant glint in the heat haze. Wind conditions had become more complex, with thermal currents rising from the canyon floor, creating unpredictable air movement. Sarah took her time, consulting her notes and making careful adjustments. The crowd grew restless. "Any time now, lady," someone called out. "We don't have all day." Maybe she's waiting for better Wi-Fi to Google the answer, another voice added, generating more laughter. Sarah blocked them out, focusing on her breathing and the mathematical relationships that governed projectile flight. Her grandfather had always said that shooting was just applied physics. If you understood the variables, you could predict the outcome. Her first shot at 200 meters was a hit, but off-center. Close enough to score, but not the precision she needed. The crowd reacted with mock applause. "Participation trophy right there," Griffin announced to his followers. "That's what happens when you don't understand the fundamentals." But Sarah was already analyzing what had gone wrong. The wind had shifted between her calculation and her shot. She adjusted her holdover and fired again. This time, the bullet struck closer to center. "Better," Tom Rodriguez said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. "Trust your numbers." The comment was simple, but it reminded Sarah of something crucial. Her calculations were good. She'd spent months preparing, running scenarios, accounting for variables that most shooters never considered. Her grandfather's training had been thorough, and her engineering background gave her tools that others lacked. Her third shot at 200 meters was nearly perfect, a clean hit in the high-scoring ring. The crowd's reaction was notably muted. Griffin Hayes glanced over at her target through his spotting scope, his expression darkening. "Got lucky with the wind," he said dismissively, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. As they moved to 400 meters, Sarah noticed the atmosphere beginning to shift. The easy mockery was being replaced by something more hostile, a growing realization that she might actually be competitive. The jokes became nastier, the accidents more frequent. During her preparation for the 400-meter round, someone knocked over her water bottle, soaking her shooting mat. When she asked for time to dry it off, Jim Henley shook his head. "Competition schedule doesn't accommodate wet equipment," he announced officially. "Shooters adapt or they don't." Sarah was forced to shoot from a damp mat, adding another variable to an already complex equation. But again, her shots found their mark. Not perfect, but consistent enough to keep her in contention. The breaking point came during the final preparation for 100 meters, the ultimate test that would determine the winner. Sarah was reviewing her notes when she overheard Griffin talking to Marcus Webb near the announcer's booth. "This whole thing's becoming a circus," Griffin was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "We're supposed to be showcasing serious marksmanship, not some diversity stunt. The sport has standards for a reason," Marcus nodded sympathetically. "Don't worry. Reality has a way of asserting itself at 100. That's where the pretenders get exposed." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. This wasn't just about beating her anymore. It was about ensuring she failed publicly and spectacularly. They wanted her humiliation to be complete and broadcast to thousands of viewers. She thought about her grandfather, about the patient hours he'd spent teaching her, not just to shoot, but to think like a marksman, about the late nights she'd spent running calculations preparing for this moment, about every condescending comment and dismissive look she'd endured in her career. Sarah opened her notebook to a fresh page and began her final calculations for 100 meters. Her handwriting was steady, her math precise. She had one shot left, to make it count. The crowd pressed closer as competitors prepared for the final round. Cameras focused on the top contenders, but Sarah noticed several lenses pointed her way too. Win or lose, she'd become part of the story. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced with theatrical drama, "this is what we've all been waiting for. 1,500 meters, the ultimate test of man versus physics." Sarah almost smiled at his choice of words. Man versus physics, indeed. Preparation. And revelation. As the sun reached its peak, casting harsh shadows across Windmark Canyon, Sarah found herself in an unexpected position. Despite the sabotage, harassment, and hostile environment, she'd managed to stay competitive through sheer determination and superior preparation. The final 1,500-meter round would determine the winner, and she was still in the running. During the extended break before the championship round, Sarah retreated to her car to review her calculations in private. She needed to be absolutely certain of her numbers. There would be no second chances at this range. As she spread her notebooks across the passenger seat, a gentle tap on her window made her look up. Tom Rodriguez stood outside, holding 2 bottles of water and wearing a concerned expression. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" he asked when she rolled down the window. Sarah hesitated. She'd been burned by false friendships before, but something in Tom's demeanor seemed genuine. She unlocked the passenger door. "Rough day?" Tom said, settling into the seat and handing her a water bottle. "I've been competing here for 12 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this." Sarah took a sip of water, studying his face. Tom was in his 60s, with calloused hands and the patient bearing of someone who'd spent decades perfecting his craft. Unlike the younger competitors, he carried himself without arrogance. "If you're shooting well," he continued, "better than most of them want to admit, your fundamentals are solid, and your calculations," he gestured at her notebooks. "That's old-school precision. Your grandfather teach you?" Sarah nodded, surprised by his insight. "Marines, Vietnam era. He always said shooting was just math with consequences." Tom smiled. "Smart man. I knew a few." "Like him?" He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Listen, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I overheard Griffin talking to some of the other shooters during lunch." "They're planning something for the final round." Sarah's stomach tightened. "What kind of something?" "Nothing they could get in serious trouble for, but enough to rattle you, extra noise, maybe some equipment accidents. They want you to fold, under pressure." Tom's expression was grim. "It's not right, but it's also not entirely unexpected. This sport has a culture problem." Sarah felt a mix of anger and disappointment. She'd hoped that excellence would speak for itself, that her shooting would eventually earn respect. Instead, she was facing organized harassment. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Tom was quiet for a moment, staring out at the canyon. "I have 3 daughters, all of them smarter than me, all of them tougher than they should have to be. I've watched them face this kind of garbage in their own careers." He looked at her directly. "Plus, your shooting reminds me of someone I knew in the service. Guy named Martinez? Any relation?" Sarah's breath caught. "Roberto Martinez was my grandfather." Tom's eyes widened. "Robbie Martinez? Hell, I served with him in 71. Best natural marksman I ever saw, and that includes 40 years of competition shooting." He shook his head in amazement. "That man could read wind like poetry, taught me more about ballistics in 6 months than I learned in 10 years of shooting matches." Suddenly, everything made more sense. Her grandfather's patient lessons, his insistence on mathematical precision, his emphasis on thinking through problems rather than just reacting to them. He'd been training her for more than just shooting. He'd been preparing her for moments exactly like this. "He talked about you," Sarah said softly. "Always said his army buddies were too stubborn to appreciate Marine wisdom." Tom laughed. "Sounds like Robbie. Cocky bastard was usually right, though." His expression grew serious. "He'd be proud of how you're handling this. That kind of grace under pressure can't be taught." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of family history settling between them. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced all day, validation from someone who understood both her grandfather's legacy and the challenges she faced. "I need to ask you something," Tom said. "Your calculations, they're all manual, aren't they? No digital assistance?" Sarah nodded. "Grandfather insisted on it. Said technology could fail, but mathematics was eternal." Tom whistled low. "Do you realize what that means? Every other shooter out here is using computer-assisted ballistics, apps, digital scopes, real-time weather integration. You're doing in your head what they need machines for." The implications hit Sarah like a revelation. She'd been competing with one hand tied behind her back, using methods that were decades old, while her competitors relied on cutting-edge technology. And despite that disadvantage, she was still in contention. "There's something else," Tom continued. "I did some research during lunch. That defense contractor you work for, Tesseron Labs, they make ballistic software, don't they?" Sarah's pulse quickened. "Target Logic version 6.2. I'm the lead engineer on the project." Tom's expression shifted to something approaching. Or, "Jesus Christ, you wrote the software half these guys are using to try to beat you." The irony was almost overwhelming. Her own algorithms running on the expensive tablets and digital scopes around her were being used by competitors who saw her as fundamentally inferior. She'd literally created the tools they depended on while choosing to rely on more traditional methods herself. That's actually hilarious," Sarah said, feeling a smile tug at her lips for the first time all day. "It's more than hilarious," Tom replied. "It's poetic justice waiting to happen." As they prepared to return to the firing line, Tom placed a paternal hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Your grandfather saw something in you worth developing," he said. "Trust his training, trust your numbers, and don't let these bastards take away what you've earned." Sarah nodded, feeling a new kind of confidence settling over her. She wasn't just carrying her own hopes anymore. She was honoring a legacy, proving a point, and maybe even changing a culture. As she walked back toward lane 47, Sarah noticed the crowd had grown significantly. Word had spread about the underdog engineer who was competing with Vietnam-era techniques against modern technology. Some spectators seemed genuinely curious to see what would happen. Others appeared to be hoping for a spectacular failure. Griffin Hayes watched her approach with undisguised hostility. His earlier confidence had been replaced by something sharper and more desperate. He'd built his reputation on dominance, and the possibility of losing to someone he'd publicly mocked was clearly eating at him. "Final round, sweetheart," he called out as she passed. "This is where reality sets in. 1,500 meters doesn't forgive pretenders." Sarah paused, meeting his gaze with new resolve. "No," she said calmly. "It doesn't." The certainty in her voice seemed to unnerve him. For the first time all day, Griffin Hayes looked genuinely worried. The system responds. The tension at Windmark Canyon had reached a breaking point as competitors prepared for the final 500-meter shot. Sarah's steady climb up the leaderboard had transformed what should have been a routine victory for Griffin Hayes into something resembling a crisis. The shooting community's established order was being challenged by someone they dismissed as a curiosity. Sarah was adjusting her rifle's position when she noticed Jim Henley approaching with an official-looking clipboard and a stern expression. Two other range officials flanked him, creating an obvious display of authority that drew the attention of nearby competitors and spectators. "Miss Martinez," Jim announced loudly enough for cameras to pick up, "we need to conduct an equipment inspection before the final round." Sarah looked up, confused. "An inspection? Has someone complained about my equipment?" "Safety protocols," Jim replied curtly. "Given the Unusual circumstances of today's competition, we want to ensure everything meets regulation standards. The unusual circumstances clearly referred to her unexpected competitiveness, but Sarah knew better than to argue in front of the crowd. She stood back as the officials examined her rifle with exaggerated thoroughness, checking components that had been deemed acceptable all day. "This scope mount is borderline," one official muttered, loud enough for spectators to hear. "Could be considered non-standard," Sarah's heart sank. The mount was identical to several others being used in the competition, but she realized this wasn't really about equipment compliance. This was about finding a reason to disqualify her before she could embarrass the establishment favorites. "The mount is within specifications," she said firmly. "It was approved during morning inspection." Jim consulted his clipboard with theatrical seriousness. Regulations can be interpreted differently depending on circumstances. Given the high-stakes nature of the final round, we're applying enhanced scrutiny. Translation: they were changing the rules because she was winning. Tom Rodriguez had been watching the interaction from his nearby lane. He approached the group with the confident bearing of someone who'd been part of this community for decades. "Jim," he said, conversationally, "that's the same mount type I've been using for 8 years, same one Griffin has on his backup rifle." He gestured toward Hayes's equipment table. "You going to inspect everyone's gear with this level of thoroughness?" Jim's jaw tightened. He clearly hadn't expected pushback from an established competitor. "We're following standard protocols, Tom." "Standard protocols, my ass," Tom replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned respect through years of straight shooting and fair play. "This is a bullshit intimidation tactic, and everyone here knows it." A murmur ran through the growing crowd of spectators. Several competitors had stopped their own preparations to watch the confrontation unfold. Sarah noticed phones being raised to record the exchange. Griffin Hayes materialized at the edge of the group, ostensibly curious but clearly invested in the outcome. "Problem here?" he asked, with false concern. "No problem," Sarah said, looking directly at Jim. "Unless following the same rules as everyone else is somehow problematic." Her tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it. She'd spent her entire career dealing with men who moved goalposts when they couldn't win by merit. This wasn't her first rodeo with institutional bias. Jim seemed to realize he was walking into a public relations disaster. The livestream chat was already buzzing with comments about rigged competitions and good old boy networks. Several spectators were openly recording the interaction on their phones. "Equipment passes inspection," he announced abruptly, clearly hoping to end the scene before it escalated further, but Griffin wasn't ready to let it go. "Still seems pretty convenient," he said with a smirk. "Outsider shows up with basic gear and suddenly shoots like Annie Oakley. Makes you wonder what else might be non-standard." The implication was clear and deeply offensive. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with anger, but Tom stepped forward before she could respond. "You want to make accusations, Griffin?" Tom's voice carried decades of quiet authority. "Because I've been watching all day, and the only thing non-standard here is the way you and your buddies have been treating a fellow competitor." "I'm just saying," Griffin began. "You're saying a lot of things," Tom interrupted. "Most of them wrong. This lady has outshot half the field using equipment older than your social media career. Maybe instead of looking for conspiracies, you should focus on the fundamentals your sponsors pay you to demonstrate." The verbal slap hit its target. Griffin's face flushed red, and for a moment Sarah thought he might actually throw a punch. The tension was broken by Marcus Webb's voice over the PA system. "Shooters to the line! Final round begins in 10 minutes. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah found herself shaking slightly, not from nerves, but from suppressed rage. The systematic attempts to undermine her had crystallized something in her mind. This wasn't just about winning a shooting competition anymore. It was about proving that excellence couldn't be dismissed, diminished, or disqualified by prejudice. "You okay?" Tom asked quietly as they returned to their lanes. "I'm perfect," Sarah replied, and for the first time all day, she meant it. She opened her notebook to the final page of calculations, reviewing the numbers she'd worked and reworked for months. Wind speed, temperature, barometric pressure, elevation, angle. Every variable accounted for and calculated by hand. Her grandfather's teachings, refined through years of engineering precision. Around her, competitors were making final adjustments to their computerized systems, checking digital readouts, and running last-minute calculations through their apps. Several were using tablets loaded with Target Logic 6.2, her software, her algorithms, her code. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. They had no idea they were relying on her work to try to beat her. Marcus Webb's voice boomed across the canyon. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is it. One shot, 1/500 meters. Winner takes all. Let's see who's got what it takes." Sarah settled into position behind her rifle, feeling the familiar comfort of the stock against her cheek. The target was barely visible at 1/1500 meters, a distant speck of steel wavering in the heat haze. But she could see it clearly in her mind. Exactly where it was, exactly where her bullet needed to go. She closed her eyes for a moment, hearing her grandfather's voice. "Mathematics doesn't lie, Miha. Trust the numbers, trust your training, and trust yourself." When she opened her eyes, Sarah Martinez was ready to show them exactly what trust looked like. The shot heard round the world. The silence at Windmark Canyon was absolute as Sarah Martinez settled into her final firing position. 1/500 meters of empty air stretched between her and a steel target that looked impossibly small through her scope. Around her, 100 competitors and twice as many spectators held their collective breath. She'd drawn the final shooting position. Lane 47, last to fire, with everyone else's scores already posted on the electronic leaderboard. Griffin Hayes held the lead with an impressive 9.8 out of 10, followed closely by Brett Kane at 9.6. Sarah needed a perfect 10 to win, and anything less than 9.5 would drop her out of the top 3 entirely. The pressure should have been overwhelming, but instead, Sarah felt a strange calm settling over her. Her grandfather's notebook lay open beside her, 40 years of accumulated wisdom distilled into neat columns of numbers. Her own calculations filled the margins. Wind corrections, temperature adjustments, elevation compensations, all worked. "Out by hand. Take your time, shooter," Marcus Webb announced over the PA system, his voice carrying a newfound respect that hadn't been there in the morning. This is what legends are made of. Sarah ignored the commentary and focused on her breathing. 4 counts in, hold for 4, release for 4. Her pulse slowed, her vision sharpened, and the distant target seemed to grow clearer in her scope. Wind was the critical factor at this range. She'd been tracking its patterns all day, noting how thermal currents rose from the canyon floor in predictable cycles. Right now, conditions were as close to perfect as they were likely to get. Minimal crosswind, steady temperature, no mirage distortion. She made her final scope adjustment. 2 clicks up, 1 click left. The mathematics of ballistics played out in her head like a familiar song. Muzzle velocity, 2,750 feet per second. Bullet drop at 1/500 meters, 37.2 inches. Wind drift in current conditions, 4.8 inches left. Tom Rodriguez, who had finished his own shooting, knelt beside her mat in the spotter position. "Wind steady at your 2 o'clock, he murmured quietly. "Thermal's about to shift. You've got maybe 30 seconds of stable air." Sarah nodded, grateful for the support. She settled deeper into her shooting position, feeling the rifle become an extension of her body. Through her scope, the target wavered slightly in the heat haze, but she could see it clearly. A 12-inch square of steel that represented everything she'd worked toward. Behind her, she heard Griffin Hayes muttering to his crew, "No way she makes this shot. Physics doesn't lie, and neither do fundamentals." The irony wasn't lost on her. Griffin was absolutely right. Physics didn't lie. But he had no idea how deeply she understood those physics, how many sleepless nights she'd spent modeling ballistic trajectories, how her software had revolutionized the very field he claimed to master. Sarah's breathing slowed to almost nothing. Her finger found the trigger, applying steady pressure until she reached the precise point of release. The world narrowed to just her, the rifle, and that distant speck of steel. The shot broke with perfect surprise, exactly as her grandfather had taught her. The rifle's recoil pushed back against her shoulder as the bullet began its 3-second journey across the canyon. Sarah stayed in position, watching through her scope as the projectile flew downrange at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. Time seemed suspended. The crowd was silent, cameras focused, everyone waiting for the spotting scope to reveal where her bullet had struck. At 1,500 meters, even a perfect shot took time to reach its target. Then the steel target rang like a bell, the sound echoing off the canyon walls with crystal clarity. Through the spotting scope, officials could see the bullet hole exactly where it needed to be. Dead center, as close to perfect as measuring equipment could determine. The silence stretched for another heartbeat before Marcus Webb's voice exploded across the canyon. Perfect score. Perfect 10! Ladies and gentlemen, we have a new champion! The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers, gasps, and stunned silence. Sarah remained motionless behind her rifle for several seconds, hardly believing what had just happened. Then Tom Rodriguez was pulling her to her feet, grinning like a proud father. "Hell of a shot, Annie Oakley," he said, using Griffin's earlier taunt as a compliment. "Your grandfather would be dancing." Camera crews rushed toward her position, but Sarah barely noticed. She was looking at the leaderboard where her name had just jumped to the top with a perfect score. Below her, Griffin Hayes stared at the numbers in apparent disbelief. "How?" he muttered, loud enough for nearby microphones to pick up. "How is that even possible?" Sarah heard the question and turned to face him directly. For the first time all day, she allowed herself a smile. "Mathematics," she said simply. Marcus Webb appeared at her side with a microphone, his earlier condescension replaced by genuine awe. "Sarah Martinez, ladies and gentlemen, from dead last to first place with a perfect shot. Sarah, how does it feel?" Sarah looked out at the crowd, some cheering, some still processing what they'd witnessed, others frantically checking their phones to understand how the day's narrative had just been completely rewritten. "It feels like vindication," she said into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon. Behind the crowd, she noticed Jim Henley standing with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met across the distance, and Sarah saw something that might have been respect flickering in his gaze. But the real satisfaction came from watching Griffin Hayes pack up his equipment in stunned silence. The man who had dismissed her as a diversity stunt just hours earlier now couldn't meet her eyes. His entourage had melted away, leaving him alone with his expensive gear and wounded pride. "Sarah!" a young voice called out from the crowd. She turned to see a teenage girl pushing through the spectators, her father trailing behind with an apologetic expression. "My daughter insisted on meeting you," the man explained. She's been following the live stream all day. The girl, maybe 16 with bright eyes and calloused hands that suggested she was a shooter herself, looked up at Sarah with unmistakable hero worship. "That was incredible," she breathed. "I've never seen anything like it." "You made it look so scientific." Sarah knelt down to the girl's level. "What's your name?" "Jessica. Jessica Chen. I compete in junior rifle at my high school." The words tumbled out in a rush. "Everyone says girls can't shoot at long range because we don't have the strength, but you just proved them all wrong." "Strength has nothing to do with precision," Sarah said gently. "It's about understanding the physics and trusting your preparation." "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do." As Jessica and her father moved away, chatting excitedly about technique and equipment, Sarah felt something shift inside her. This victory wasn't just personal anymore. It was symbolic, a demonstration that excellence couldn't be diminished by prejudice, that competence spoke louder than condescension. The awards ceremony was a surreal experience. Sarah stood on the makeshift podium, holding a trophy that felt heavier than it should, listening to Marcus Webb deliver remarks that bore no resemblance to his earlier commentary. The live-stream chat, which had been filled with mockery hours earlier, now buzzed with respect and admiration. But the moment that mattered most came as she was packing up her grandfather's rifle. Tom Rodriguez approached with something in his hand, a faded photograph showing 2 young Marines in Vietnam-era fatigues. "Thought you might like to see this," he said. "Your grandfather and me, a 1971 best spotter team in our unit." Sarah studied the photo, seeing her grandfather's familiar smile and recognizing the same patient confidence she'd grown up admiring. In the picture, he was holding a rifle not unlike the one she'd just used to win her first major competition. "He always said shooting was just math with consequences," she murmured. "Smart man," Tom replied. "But he also said something else about you. Said you had the gift, not just for shooting, but for seeing the whole picture." Guess he was right. Teachy. Sarah drove away from Windmark Canyon, the trophy secured in her passenger seat, and her grandfather's rifle safely cased in the trunk. She couldn't help but smile. Her phone had been buzzing with interview requests, sponsorship inquiries, and messages of congratulation from colleagues who'd followed the live stream. But the message that meant the most was a text from her supervisor at Tesseron Labs. "Watched. The whole thing. Proud to have you on our team. Take Monday off. You've earned it." Sarah Martinez had entered Windmark Canyon as an unknown engineer with a borrowed rifle and borrowed techniques. She was leaving as a champion, carrying forward a legacy of precision and proving that excellence needed no permission to announce itself. The reckoning. The week following Sarah's victory at Windmark Canyon brought consequences that rippled far, beyond the shooting sports community. Video clips of her perfect 150-100-meter shot had gone viral, accumulating millions of views and sparking conversations about sexism in competitive sports. More importantly, for those who had tried to sabotage her, the footage also captured every moment of harassment, bias, and unprofessional conduct she'd endured. Sarah returned to work at Tesseron Labs on Tuesday to find her inbox flooded with media, requests, and her desk decorated with congratulatory flowers from colleagues. But the most significant development came during her morning meeting with Dr. Patricia Wells, the company's chief technology officer. "Sarah, we need to discuss the publicity from your competition," Dr. Wells began, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "Specifically the fact that our lead ballistics engineer just demonstrated the superiority of manual calculations over the digital systems everyone else was using." Sarah felt a moment of concern. Had her victory somehow embarrassed the company whose software she'd helped develop? "The thing is," Dr. Wells continued with a growing smile, It turns out having a world-class marksman as our chief engineer is incredibly good for business. We've had 12 major defense contractors reach out since Sunday, all wanting to discuss target logic licensing. Apparently, they're very interested in software developed by someone who can actually shoot. The irony was delicious. Sarah's old-school victory had somehow validated the modern technology she'd helped create, proving that the algorithms were sound, even when implemented by someone who understood them well enough not to need them. But the real satisfaction came from the phone call she received that Wednesday afternoon. "Miss Martinez, this is David Patterson from the National Shooting Sports Foundation. I'm calling to inform you that we've received several complaints about the conduct at last weekend's Winmark Open division." Sarah listened as Patterson detailed a formal investigation into the competition's administration. Multiple spectators had submitted video evidence of biased officiating, harassment, and attempts to manipulate equipment inspections. The NSSF took such matters seriously, particularly when they were broadcast to thousands of viewers. "What does that mean practically?" Sarah asked. "Well, for starters, Jim Henley has been suspended from his position as range director, pending a full review. The Winmark facility is being placed on probation, and their sanction to host national-level competitions is under review." Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She'd never wanted to destroy careers or shut down facilities. She'd just wanted to compete fairly. But actions had consequences, and the shooting sports community was finally being forced to confront its culture problem. The conversation continued with an unexpected offer. "The Foundation would like to invite you to join our Diversity and Inclusion Committee. We're working to make competitive shooting more welcoming to all participants, and your experience, both as an engineer and as a competitor, would be invaluable." Sarah accepted immediately. If her victory could help other women and minorities avoid the treatment she'd received, then every moment of harassment had been worth it. The most dramatic fallout involved Griffin Hayes. His sponsors began distancing themselves from him after video clips showed his unsportsmanlike conduct and disrespectful comments. By Thursday, 2 major manufacturers had terminated their endorsement deals, citing values misalignment and unprofessional behavior. Griffin's downfall accelerated when investigative journalists began digging into his background. They discovered a pattern of complaints from female participants at his tactical training courses, allegations of inappropriate comments, dismissive instruction, and creating hostile environments that had been quietly settled or ignored. Sarah learned about Griffin's troubles from Tom Rodriguez, who called her Thursday evening with an update on the shooting community's response. "Word is spreading fast," Tom reported. "A lot of people are finally speaking up about behavior they've tolerated for years. Your victory didn't just win a competition, it gave people permission to demand better." "I never intended for any of this," Sarah said, though she felt more satisfaction than regret. "That's exactly why it matters," Tom replied. "You weren't looking for revenge or trying to destroy anyone. You just wanted to compete fairly and let your abilities speak for themselves. Sometimes that's the most powerful statement of all." The vindication continued throughout the week. Brett Kane, the social media influencer who had mocked her spreadsheet approach, posted a public apology video that quickly became a case study in how not to handle controversy. His awkward, clearly scripted remarks about learning and growing fooled no one and became the subject of countless parody videos. Marcus Webb, the announcer who had turned her struggles into entertainment, found himself facing a different kind of accountability. The Winmark range terminated his contract, and several other venues began reconsidering their relationships with him. His attempts at damage control, claiming he'd been building drama for entertainment value, only made things worse. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from unexpected sources. Sarah began receiving messages from young women across the country who had been inspired by her performance. High school shooting teams, ROTC programs, and engineering students all reached out to share their own stories and ask for advice. One message particularly moved her. It came from Jessica Chen, the teenage girl who had approached her after the competition. Ms. Martinez, I wanted you to know that I joined my school's precision rifle team this week. When the coach said girls usually don't compete at long range, I told him about you and showed him the video of your 1500-meter shot. He changed his tune pretty quickly. Thank you for showing us what's possible. Friday brought the most satisfying development of all. Sarah received an official letter from the Windmark Canyon Board of Directors, the same organization that had allowed her harassment to continue unchallenged. The letter was both an apology and an invitation. Dear Ms. Martinez, it read, the board wishes to formally apologize for the unacceptable treatment you received during our recent competition. We are implementing comprehensive policy changes to ensure all competitors are treated with respect and professionalism. Additionally, we would like to invite you to serve as our technical advisor for future competitions and to consider Windmark Canyon as a potential venue for a precision shooting clinic or training program you might wish to develop. Sarah set the letter aside with a smile. The same people who had dismissed her as a diversity stunt were now begging for her expertise and association. The transformation was complete, from unwanted outsider to sought-after expert in the span of a single perfect shot. As she prepared to leave work that Friday, Sarah opened her desk drawer and pulled out her grandfather's notebook. She turned to a blank page and wrote a single line. Mission accomplished, abuelo. The math was perfect. Outside her office window, the Arizona sunset painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah gathered her things and headed home, already planning her next competition. She had a title to defend, a legacy to honor, and a community to change, one precise shot at a time. Legacy. 6 months after her victory at Windmark Canyon, Sarah Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at the National Shooting Sports Foundation's annual conference. The audience included range operators, equipment manufacturers, military instructors, and competitive shooters from across the country, many of whom were implementing changes directly inspired by her experience. Excellence doesn't ask for permission, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. It doesn't wait for approval or acceptance. It simply performs consistently and precisely until the world has no choice but to acknowledge what was always true. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 2 minutes. Sarah looked out at the crowd, noting faces she recognized. Tom Rodriguez in the front row, beaming with pride. Dr. Wells from Tesseron Labs, taking notes for the company's diversity initiatives. Even Jim Henley, who had completed sensitivity training and was slowly rebuilding his reputation through genuine reform efforts. Notably absent were Griffin Hayes and Brett Kane, both of whom had largely disappeared from the competitive shooting scene. Griffin's tactical training company had folded after numerous clients cancelled contracts, and Brett's social media presence had dwindled to almost nothing. They had become cautionary tales about the cost of prejudice in a community that increasingly valued inclusivity. Sarah's keynote address covered the technical aspects of precision shooting, but her real message was about perseverance and the power of preparation. She shared the mathematics behind her record-breaking shot, but also the emotional journey that had brought her to that moment. My grandfather taught me that shooting was applied physics, she explained. But he also taught me that physics doesn't care about your gender, your background, or whether other people believe you belong. Gravity affects everyone equally. Wind resistance follows the same laws for every bullet. Excellence is measurable, objective, and ultimately undeniable. After her speech, Sarah was approached by dozens of audience members. Young women seeking mentorship, range operators asking for consultation on inclusive policies, and equipment manufacturers interested in collaborating with someone who understood both the technical and human sides of the sport. The most meaningful conversation came with Captain Maria Vega, a Marine officer who ran her service's precision marksmanship program. "Ms. Martinez, I've been following your story since Windmark," Captain Vega said. "We're reforming our training protocols to be more welcoming to female recruits. Would you consider consulting on our program development?" Sarah accepted immediately. Working with the military would complete a circle begun by her grandfather's service and continued through her own dedication to the craft he'd taught her. Later that evening, at the conference's awards banquet, Sarah received the NSSF's first ever Excellence in Leadership Award. As she accepted the crystal trophy, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from a dismissed diversity hire to a recognized leader in her field. But the real measure of her impact wasn't in awards or recognition. It was in the changes she could see throughout the shooting sports community. Ranges were implementing harassment policies, competitions were training officials to recognize and address bias. Most importantly, young women were entering the sport in record numbers, inspired by the example Sarah had set. Tom Rodriguez, now serving as Sarah's unofficial mentor and frequent shooting partner, joined her at the hotel bar after the ceremony. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said, raising his glass, "not just of the shooting, but of what you've done with the platform it gave you." Sarah smiled, touching the silver chain around her neck, where her grandfather's ring still hung. "He always said one good shot could change everything. I just never realized he meant more than just hitting targets." As they talked, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Jessica Chen, now a senior in high school and captain of her shooting team. The message included a photo of Jessica holding a trophy from a recent competition, along with the words, "Following. In your footsteps, made it to state championships. Thank you for showing me what's possible." Sarah showed the photo to Tom, who nodded approvingly. That's the real victory right there, not the scores or the sponsors or the speaking fees. It's knowing that other people get to benefit from the path you cleared. A year later, Sarah published a book titled Precision Under Pressure: Mathematics, Marksmanship, and Breaking Barriers. It became required reading at several military academies and was translated into multiple languages. The proceeds funded a scholarship program for underrepresented students pursuing engineering degrees. She also established the Martinez Precision Academy, a training facility that focused on both technical excellence and inclusive instruction. The Academy's motto, inscribed above the entrance in her grandfather's handwriting, read, "Excellence needs no permission." Griffin Hayes eventually attempted a comeback, posting YouTube videos about learning from mistakes and growing as a person. But his audience had moved on, finding inspiration in authentic voices rather than manufactured redemption narratives. He faded into obscurity, a forgotten footnote in a story about genuine transformation. Sarah continued competing, winning 3 more major championships and setting 2 national records. But her greatest satisfaction came from the letters she received from young women who had entered shooting sports because they'd seen her example. Women who were now coaches, competitors, and leaders in their own right. On quiet evenings, at her ranch outside Phoenix, Sarah would often sit on her porch with her grandfather's rifle, watching the sunset paint the desert in brilliant colors. Sometimes she would open his old notebook, reading the careful notations and remembering the patient lessons that had shaped her life. The math had always been perfect. It just took the right moment, the right pressure, and the right shot to prove it to the world. In the distance, steel targets reflected the dying light, waiting for the next shooter to discover what precision really meant. Sarah smiled, chambered, around, and prepared to honor the legacy one more time. The wind was calm, the mathematics were clear, and the target was exactly where it needed to be. Some shots echo forever. Epilogue. 5 years after Windmark Canyon, the shooting sports community was fundamentally transformed. Sarah Martinez's perfect shot had done more than win a competition. It had shattered barriers, changed policies, and inspired a generation of athletes who might never have found their place in the sport otherwise. The annual Sarah Martinez Invitational, held each spring at Windmark Canyon under new management, had become one of the most prestigious events in precision shooting. Unlike traditional competitions, it emphasized both technical excellence and sportsmanship, with zero tolerance for discrimination or harassment. Sarah herself had evolved from competitor to leader, from engineer to educator, from victim of prejudice to architect of change. Her grandfather's lessons in mathematics and marksmanship had become the foundation for something larger, a movement that proved excellence could not be diminished by bias, only delayed until its moment arrived. Standing on the rim of Windmark Canyon, during the 5th annual Invitational, watching young women and men compete side by side in an atmosphere of mutual respect, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. One shot had changed everything, just as her grandfather had always said it could. The target had been 1,500 meters away. The mathematics had been perfect. The shot had been true, but the real distance covered had been measured not in meters, but in minds changed, barriers broken, and dreams made possible for those who came after. Excellence, as it turned out, was indeed eternal. If you enjoyed this story of quiet strength triumphing over prejudice, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. We share real-life tales of courage, perseverance, and the incredible power of never giving up on yourself. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to prove yourself against unfair odds? Share your story with us. Your experience might inspire the next person who needs to hear it. Stay tuned for more inspiring stories that celebrate the unsung heroes in everyday life. Remember, sometimes the most powerful victories come not from the loudest voices, but from the steadiest hands and the most determined hearts.